She would later say the land warned her before she ever crossed the threshold. Not with words, but with silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. Some truths arrive like thunder. Others leave their mark in the dirt before you even know you're afraid. Charlotte Abbott did not expect the truth to strike before she ever stepped inside the old ranch house, but it did. The instant her eyes caught the deep, fresh hoof prints pressed into the soil near the barn, prints too large and too sharp-edged to belong to any ordinary horse. And in that moment her body went still, breath locking in her throat, because whatever had made those marks had not been there long, and whatever it was still here, and she was alone. 3 days earlier she had been riding through the wide, unforgiving stretch of land along Cottonwood Creek with her mare Silver, looking for nothing more ambitious than work that paid enough to eat and a dry place to sleep, drifting from town to town so long that movement felt safer than staying, until the day she saw the notice tacked crookedly inside the courthouse offering a failed ranch for the price of $1, and something inside her, something worn thin but not yet broken, pushed her forward before doubt could catch up. She took the deed without stopping to think, fingers curling around the paper as if it might vanish if she hesitated, desperate for a chance to build a life that belonged to her and no one else. By the time she reached the 300 acres now legally hers, the sun hung low and heavy, painting the sky in tired shades of orange and gold, and the place looked every bit like what people said it was, forgotten and used up. The house sagged like an old man refusing to lie down. Fences leaned and twisted, wire rusted and broken. The barn slouched to one side as if it had long ago surrendered to time and weather. Everything carried the quiet of abandonment. But it was hers, and that single truth carried weight. She tied Silver near the well and worked the stubborn pump until cold water splashed into the bucket, watching her mare drink with gratitude. Because after days on the trail, that small kindness felt like a victory. Charlotte's own body ached in places she'd learned to ignore, but she pushed past the pain and crossed to the house, nudging the crooked door open. Dust and the smell of old years greeting her like an exhale. Furniture sat exactly where someone had left it long ago, coated in grime and silence, and still it was shelter. She dropped her pack, rolled out her bedroll, and walked the room slowly, taking inventory the way she always did. A stove she might coax back to life, a table she could scrub clean, a room that could be hers if she worked hard enough. After checking the roof for holes, she stepped back outside, the light thinning fast, and headed toward the barn to inspect it before dark. And that was when she saw the prints. Fresh, too fresh. Her hand drifted to the pistol at her hip as she approached, the setting sun throwing long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt, a chill crawling up her spine. She pushed the barn door open and paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior, breathing in old straw and rot and neglect, empty stalls and broken boards. And then a deep rumbling snort rolled through the space, low and powerful, and Charlotte's heart leapt hard against her ribs. Something shifted in the far stall, something heavy enough that the floor seemed to tremble under its weight, and she moved closer, fingers steady on the grip of her pistol, until the darkness gave way to shape and muscle and size. A horse stood there, but not like any she had ever seen. Massive and tall, coat catching the last light with a coppery, almost rusted sheen, mane tangled and wild, ribs visible beneath skin pulled tight from hunger, and yet even in neglect he carried himself with a presence that felt coiled and dangerous. What held her were his eyes, dark and sharp and alive, not frightened and not aggressive, studying her as if he were the one deciding whether she belonged. Slowly Charlotte lowered the pistol. "Well," she said softly, her voice sounding small in the barn. "I wasn't expecting company." The horse did not move, did not step forward or back, ears pricked, muscles tight, and she understood in a quiet, instinctive way that he had been alone a long time, surviving on what he could find, ready to defend himself if pressed. "I'm not here to hurt you," she murmured, backing out of the stall to give him space. "Just trying to survive, same as you." He watched her until she slipped back through the barn doors, and the weight of his gaze followed her all the way to the house. Night fell fast. Inside she lit a small lantern, but sleep would not come. She lay on her bedroll staring at the stars peeking through gaps in the roof, every sound outside snapping her nerves tight, a distant coyote, the creak of old wood, and every so often a soft movement from the barn that reminded her of living. Mystery waited there. Questions chased each other through her mind. Who he belonged to, why he'd been left, Whether he was dangerous, whether she was now responsible for him. And beneath it all settled a feeling she hadn't known in years, the quiet sense that this broken land and that lonely horse were somehow tied to her path. Dawn came too soon. Roosters she hadn't known existed screamed her awake. And sore and heavy-limbed, she brewed the strongest coffee she could manage, choked down hardtack and dried beef, then carried a bucket of fresh water toward the barn. Silver nickered a greeting, but Charlotte's eyes went straight to the last stall where the big horse stood alert watching. "Morning," she said, setting the water where he could reach it without crowding her. "Thought you might be thirsty." He waited until she stepped away before lowering his head to drink, tension easing just a fraction, and Charlotte spent the morning cleaning the barn, talking the whole time, telling him her name, where she'd come from, how she'd bought the ranch for $1 without knowing what she was stepping into. He stayed inside his stall at first, but when she hauled old straw to the manure pile, she noticed he'd edged closer to the front, watching her work. Progress so slow it felt fragile but real all the same. By the end of the day, she sat outside the barn with Silver, grazing nearby, and the copper-colored horse standing just inside his stall, calm but cautious, the sky turning pink and the land going quiet. And for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt she wasn't truly alone. She didn't know his past or his name or why his eyes looked haunted and intelligent, only that their story had begun. She woke with the sunrise day after day, and each morning she went straight to the barn, Silver nickering impatiently while Charlotte checked on the other horse first, always watching, ears forward, trust not yet given but not entirely withheld. Over the next week she worked the ranch piece by piece, patching the roof, cleaning the well, straightening what fence she could, talking as she worked because it steadied her, and maybe it steadied him too. She called him Rusty for his coat, and though he never let her touch him, he listened. On the 8th morning, humming a tune her mother once sang, she realized he was no longer in his stall, her heart jumping as she turned to find him standing only a few feet away, closer than ever before, the barn seeming to hold its breath. She lowered herself slowly, making herself smaller, and Rusty stretched his neck, warm breath brushing her palm as his nose touched her hand, a moment so delicate it felt like it might shatter.
"Hello," she whispered.
"Nice to finally meet you." After that, Rusty began to follow her, always a few steps back but never far, watching her muck stalls from the doorway, grazing nearby when she fixed fences, the distance between them shrinking day by day. With time, she found the scars hidden beneath his coat, old rope burns, whip marks, an injury that never healed right, and anger and sadness tightened her chest. "You're safe now," she promised one evening as she worked a tangle from his mane. "Nobody will ever hurt you again." Free on the ranch was harder than she'd imagined, especially with only $17 to her name. But she refused to give up, scavenging wood, stretching wire, cooking simple meals on a stubborn stove, sleeping on the floor until the house could be cleaned. Cottonwood Creek was slow to accept her. Some laughed, others doubted she'd last, but Charlotte had lived her life proving people wrong. One afternoon she rode Silver into town for supplies and felt eyes on her as she loaded her bags. A red-faced man leaning against the saloon wall with 3 others behind him. "That's her," he called. "The lady rancher." Laughter followed her out of town, burning between her shoulders. 2 weeks. Later they came to her land. Late afternoon found her repairing a water trough when Rusty stiffened, stepping in front of her as hoofbeats rose from the ridge, 3 riders emerging through dust, the red-faced man leading. Charlotte stood tall. Rusty stayed beside her, a living shield. "Afternoon," the man said. "Tom Hackett. We own land next to yours." He smiled thinly and made his offer. $20 for a cursed ranch no woman could run, and when she refused, the threats turned quiet and sharp, eyes lingering on Rusty. They left her with dust and unease, and that night she slept with her rifle close and her boots on, Rusty standing guard near the house, watching the dark. Over the following days, tools vanished. Fences were torn down, boot prints appeared, and one morning she found a dead coyote hanging from her gate, a warning she understood too well. She stayed. She would not lose this, and she knew she wasn't facing it alone. Rusty moved beside her like a shadow, partner and protector. Then one night he screamed a warning and she ran into fire, riders spreading flames through the eastern pasture, and she fought the blaze for hours, choking on smoke, Rusty beside her, stamping flames and steadying her when she stumbled. 5 acres burned, but the house and barn saved. When dawn came, she knew it wasn't over. She rode into town, reported everything, and was turned away by a tired sheriff who advised her to sell and leave. At the general store, Mr. Briggs quietly slid her a box of ammunition and a promise that not everyone would look the other way, and Charlotte rode home with a hard resolve settling into her bones, preparing for what she knew would come. Clearing brush, setting water, cleaning her weapons, talking to Rusty as if he understood every word, telling him he could run if danger came, and knowing by the look in his eyes that he wouldn't. The night of the attack arrived without a moon, hoofbeats thundering, torches flying, gunshots cracking, Rusty charging like a storm, scattering horses, Charlotte shooting torches from the sky, outnumbered and desperate until the sound of more riders broke through. Briggs and others charging in, turning the tide, Hackett's men fleeing into darkness. When it was over, Charlotte collapsed shaking and saw blood on Rusty's shoulder, felt fear twist her chest as she tended him, his massive head resting against her. Briggs telling her she'd reminded the town what standing up meant, and as dawn broke over the smoke-stained land, Charlotte whispered, "We did it," knowing even then that everything had changed. The night bled slowly into morning, smoke thinning as the first pale light crept over the hills, and Charlotte. Abbott sat on the cold ground beside the barn with Rusty's great head resting against her shoulder, her hands still trembling as she finished tying the last knot in the bandage around his wounded shoulder. The bullet had only grazed him, tearing flesh but missing bone, and even so the sight of his blood had shaken her more deeply than the fire or the gunshots ever had. Rusty stood quiet and patient while she worked, his breath warm and steady, his dark eyes fixed on her face as if anchoring her to the moment. Around them, the ranch lay scarred but standing. Blackened earth marked the eastern pasture. The smell of burned grass clung to everything. The house and barn, though streaked with soot, still rose against the morning sky, stubborn and alive. When the townspeople finally rode away, promising to return with supplies and help once daylight was full, Charlotte was left, alone again with the land and the horse who had saved it with her. Exhaustion crashed over her in waves once the danger passed. She barely remembered dragging herself into the house, barely recalled collapsing onto her bedroll with her boots still on, Rusty positioning himself just outside the door like a silent sentry. She slept then, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep earned only after survival. When she woke, the sun was already high. For a moment she didn't know where she was, only that her body ached and the air smelled faintly of smoke. And then memory returned in a rush. She was on her feet instantly, heart racing, stepping outside to find Rusty exactly where she'd last seen him, grazing slowly despite the stiffness in his injured shoulder. Relief loosened something tight inside her chest. "Easy," she murmured, approaching him carefully. He lifted his head at her voice and took a few steps toward her, stopping close enough that she could feel his warmth without reaching out. That alone felt like a victory. She spent the morning checking the damage. 5 acres of pasture were lost, blackened and useless for now, and a section of fence had burned through. But the well was untouched, the barn solid, the house safe. It could have been so much worse. As the sun climbed higher, riders appeared on the ridge again, this time familiar faces. Mr. Briggs came first, followed by 2 ranchers she recognized only by sight, and a woman from town who ran the boarding house. They brought water, food, fence posts, wire, and quiet determination. No speeches were made. They simply dismounted and got to work. Charlotte found herself overwhelmed in a way she wasn't used to, throat tight as she accepted help she'd never expected to receive. While they worked, word spread quickly through Cottonwood Creek. By midday, nearly everyone knew what had happened on the Dollar Ranch, how Hackett and his men had come in the night with fire and guns, how Charlotte, Abbott and her wild copper stallion had stood their ground until help arrived. Stories grow in the telling, and by the time they reached town, Rusty had already begun to take on the shape of legend, a giant horse who charged men and flames alike, who knew friend from foe and chose to protect. Charlotte didn't correct anyone. She was too busy hauling water, setting posts, and keeping an eye on Rusty, who refused to stray, far from her side even as others moved around the property. He watched the townspeople carefully, ears swiveling, muscles ready, but he did not panic or bolt. He trusted her enough to stay. By evening, the worst of the damage was secured. Temporary fencing stood where the old had burned, and the fire line was widened to prevent flare-ups. As the helpers prepared to leave, Briggs lingered, resting a hand on the fence rail and looking out over the land. "Sheriff won't do much," he said quietly. "But after last night, Hackett's done here. He knows he crossed a line." Charlotte nodded. "I don't want trouble," she replied. "I just want to live." Briggs met her eyes. "Sometimes that's enough to make trouble come. Looking for you." When they rode away, the ranch fell quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before, not empty or abandoned, but watchful, holding its breath after violence. Charlotte tended Rusty again that night, cleaning his wound, changing the bandage, speaking softly as she worked. "You didn't have to do that," she told him. "You could have run." Rusty flicked an ear and lowered his head, nudging her shoulder gently, and she laughed despite herself, a small sound that felt unfamiliar. In the days that followed, Charlotte worked harder than she ever had in her life. She rebuilt the burned fence properly this time, driving posts deep and stretching wire tight. She cleared dead brush from around the pasture to create a wider fire break. She repaired the barn roof and reinforced the doors. Each night she cleaned her rifle and pistol, not because she expected another attack, but because preparedness had become a form of comfort. Rusty healed steadily. The wound closed cleanly, and within a week he moved without stiffness, strength returning to his massive frame. Something in him shifted after the fight. The cautious distance he'd once kept faded. He stood closer now, followed more openly. And one evening, as Charlotte sat on the step eating a simple meal of beans, he walked right up to her and rested his chin on her shoulder. She froze, afraid to move, heart pounding, then slowly lifted a hand and laid it against his neck. His skin was warm beneath her palm, his coat rough and alive, and he didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. After that, their bond deepened quickly. Rusty allowed her to groom him fully, to clean his hooves, to check his scars without flinching. He learned her routines and anticipated her movements, meeting her at the barn each morning and escorting her back to the house each night. He watched the land with a vigilance that never fully faded, and Charlotte came to trust his instincts as much as her own. When he tensed, she paid attention. When he relaxed, she allowed herself to do the same. Weeks passed, and with them came change. Hackett and his men were seen less and less in Cottonwood Creek. Then, one day they vanished entirely, leaving behind unpaid tabs and unanswered questions. Some said they'd headed north. Others claimed they'd crossed into another territory altogether. No one seemed particularly interested in finding out. With the threat gone, the ranch began to breathe again. Grass slowly pushed through the blackened earth in the eastern pasture, stubborn green shoots against the ash. Charlotte traded labor with neighboring ranchers, mending fences in exchange for seed and advice. She bought 2 scrawny cattle with money she barely had and nursed them back to health. She planted a small garden near the house, coaxing vegetables from soil that hadn't been tended in years. The house transformed piece by piece. She patched the roof properly, scrubbed the floors, repaired the stove until it held a steady flame. She built a real bed and slept in it the first night with a sense of disbelief, waking before dawn out of habit and smiling when she remembered she was home. Town changed too, subtly at first. People greeted her by name now. Hats tipped as she rode through. The laughter that once followed her faded, replaced by nods of respect. Children asked to see the big copper horse, and Charlotte allowed it under her watchful eye. Rusty, standing calm and solid as small hands reached out to touch his neck. He tolerated it all with patient dignity, as if he understood his place in the story being told about him. Charlotte never stopped wondering where he had come from. The scars suggested hard use, perhaps as a workhorse or worse, but his intelligence hinted at training beyond brute labor. Sometimes she imagined him running wild once free and unclaimed, and other times she suspected he had known people and lost them, just as she had. She never pressed the question. Some past did not need to be uncovered to be understood. Winter came early that year. Frost crept into the mornings, and snow followed not long after, covering the land in white that muffled sound and softened edges. Charlotte prepared as best she could, stacking wood, storing food, reinforcing the barn against the cold. Rusty seemed to thrive in the winter air, his coat thickening, his breath steaming as he moved through the snow like it was nothing more than dust. On the coldest nights, he stayed close to the house, and Charlotte slept easier knowing he was there. There were hard days. Storms that lasted too long. Nights when the wind howled so fiercely she wondered if the roof would hold. Moments when loneliness crept back in, quiet and insistent. But each time she found Rusty nearby, a solid presence that grounded her, and she reminded herself how far she had come. By the time spring returned, the ranch no longer looked cursed. It looked alive. Fences stood straight. Cattle grazed in the pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning. Charlotte stood on her porch one evening watching the sunset, Rusty grazing nearby, and realized she was no longer waiting for something to go wrong. She was planning for what came next. Spring had come fully now, carrying longer days and warmer winds, and with it, a sense of rhythm to the ranch that Charlotte had never known before. She woke each morning to the same pattern, Silver nuzzling at her shoulder, Rusty waiting in the barn doorway, ears pricked and muscles taut, ready to follow her anywhere. Their walks to the barn became a ritual. She carried feed and water, brushed Silver and Rusty in turn, whispering stories of her past, of roads traveled and towns passed, and Rusty listened, eyes attentive, the occasional flick of his ear or subtle shift of weight, showing he understood more than any ordinary horse might. Charlotte never touched him without care, never forced him closer than he wanted, and over time, the invisible line between them shortened, a delicate trust growing in the spaces between breath and gesture. The ranch itself demanded everything she had, and Charlotte gave it willingly. She repaired fences that the fire had not claimed, stretched wire until her hands blistered, dug out the well to clean months of sediment, and patched holes in the barn roof with scavenged boards. She had learned that a woman alone could be underestimated, and she used it. Townspeople watched her work from a distance at first, some whispering, others laughing, but slowly respect replaced mockery. When she rode into Cottonwood Creek for supplies, men tipped hats, women called greetings, and children pressed close to see the copper horse who had saved a home. Charlotte, ever cautious, let Rusty stand a few steps back, teaching the children how to approach him, never rushing, always patient. Rusty became more than a horse. He was a partner, a sentinel, a living extension of her determination. One afternoon, while Charlotte fixed a broken section of fence, she noticed him moving unusually close. The stallion's ears were forward, nostrils flared, eyes scanning a ridge beyond the property line. Charlotte followed his gaze and spotted movement. A rider, dusty and deliberate, edging closer to the ranch. Her pulse quickened. Hackett's shadow had returned. She lowered her voice, speaking softly as she crouched, one hand brushing Rusty's mane. "It's okay. We'll handle it." The stallion's muscles coiled beneath her palm, and in that quiet communication, she knew they would face it together. The rider called out as he approached, waving an arm in forced cheer. "Charlotte Abbott. We've come to talk business." Charlotte straightened, sun catching the sweat on her brow, eyes narrowing, pistol close at hand. Rusty stamped once, low and warning. She did not flinch. "I'm busy," she said calmly, voice carrying over the dry wind. "If you have business, go back to town and leave me in peace." The man dismounted, red-faced with the telltale sneer of someone used to getting his way. Behind him, two more riders appeared. Hackett's men, the remnants who hadn't fled after the fire. The tension coiled in the air, dust rising beneath their horses' hooves. "This land isn't meant for a woman alone," the man spat, stepping closer. "Winter's coming. You'll regret holding out." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "I won't sell," Rusty growled, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, muscles tensing as the intruders slowed their approach, suddenly aware that the horse was not ordinary. Negotiation failed quickly. Threats escalated. One of the younger men spat on the dirt at Rusty's hooves, and the stallion's ears flattened. Charlotte's hand hovered over her rifle. Hackett noticed and cursed under his breath. "Think carefully, Miss Abbott," he said. "A woman alone isn't ready for this land." But the warning in Rusty's posture was unmistakable. Charlotte did not blink. "You've made your choice," she said. The men laughed uneasily, glanced at each other, and eventually rode off, leaving a trail of dust and tension behind them. But Charlotte knew this was only a warning. The real fight had not yet come. Days later, small acts of sabotage began. Tools vanished overnight. Freshly repaired fences were torn down. Boot prints appeared in the soft earth near the barn. One morning, she discovered a dead coyote hanging from the gate, a stark message that someone was testing her, daring her to flee. She did not once. Rusty remained at her side through it all, silent and vigilant. His presence a shield and a reminder that they were not truly alone. Charlotte reinforced fencing, secured the barn doors, checked locks and windows, and still she rose each day with a fierce resolve, moving like a shadow across the property, speaking to Rusty softly, asking for his attention, his guidance, even though she knew she did not have to. "If danger comes," she whispered one evening as she brushed his coat, "you can run. I won't hold it against you." The stallion looked at her with those deep, knowing eyes, and she understood without words he would not leave. The night of the real attack came without warning. Moonless darkness swallowed the ranch. Charlotte awoke to the sound of hooves pounding across the ridge. 6 or more riders charging fast, torches cutting streaks of fire through the black night. Rusty screamed a warning call, shrill and urgent, shaking the air with his power. Charlotte grabbed her rifle, heart hammering, and ran to the window, firelight casting shadows across the room. The first torches landed near the barn and house. Gunshots cracked the night. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of horses. Rusty exploded into motion, a wild force of muscle and fury, charging directly at a cluster of riders. Horses panicked, some throwing men, others bolting. Rusty swung with the precision of a tempest, driving the attackers back, keeping them away from the buildings with a force that bordered on unstoppable. Charlotte used the distraction to fire at the torches, the bright flames arcing through the night sky. But the attackers were too many, the odds too high. Her body burned with effort, her arms shook, and for a terrifying moment she feared they might be overwhelmed. Then the sound of hooves came again, faster, stronger, from the direction of town. Relief and disbelief warred within her. Mr. Briggs appeared first, riding hard despite his age, shotgun across the saddle, followed by 4 townspeople, all armed and riding with a determination born of loyalty and courage. "For Miss Abbott!" Briggs shouted. They charged into the chaos, cutting through the riders with precision and force, and Hackett's men scattered, panic breaking their ranks. Within minutes the danger was gone. Silence fell, heavy and full of ash. Charlotte sank to her knees, trembling as Rusty limped toward her, blood marring his copper coat. She pressed her hands over the wound, soothing him, feeling fear twist her chest. "You're hurt," she whispered. Rusty pressed his massive head against her, steadying her heartbeat. Briggs walked up beside her, brushing soot from his face. "That's quite a horse you've got there," he said. "Never seen anything like it." Charlotte's voice trembled as she replied, "Thank you for coming." Briggs nodded. "You reminded this town something important. Standing up matters. Hackett won't be back, not after tonight." Charlotte remained kneeling, running hands over Rusty's mane, and for the first time in years felt complete relief, a sense that the fight had been worth every bruise, burn and sleepless night. The following months were a rhythm of rebuilding and renewal. Word of the Dollar Ranch battle and the stallion who fought alongside her spread, carried on whispers, letters, and travelers passing through. Respect replaced doubt in Cottonwood Creek. People who had once laughed at her offered advice, tips, and occasionally labor. Hackett and his men disappeared from the territory entirely. Charlotte rebuilt the ranch meticulously. Fences repaired, barns strengthened, house restored, small cattle herd established, a garden planted, all under the watchful, unwavering presence of Rusty. The stallion became the heart of the land, strong, healthy, and unafraid. He worked cattle with her, stood sentinel during storms, warned her of strangers, and allowed Charlotte to understand in a way no one else had. Loyalty was earned, trust was rare, and love could exist without words. Charlotte never learned where Rusty came from or why he had been abandoned. It no longer mattered. What mattered was their bond, forged in fire and fear, strengthened by hardship, and sealed in mutual understanding. They had both been lost once, and now they were found together, in a place where courage, determination, and a copper-coated horse had rewritten the story of survival. 2 years passed, and the Dollar Ranch, once a place of ruin and fear, had grown into something neither Charlotte nor anyone else would have believed possible. The fences were straight and strong, the barn solid and welcoming, the house restored with care and pride. Gardens bloomed, cattle grazed in pastures that had once been blackened earth, and the creek ran clear again, singing through the property with a sound that felt like home. Charlotte had changed too. She rode with confidence, carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had faced danger and survived. whose sweat and blood had built not just a home but a life. She rose early each day, moved with purpose, and no longer flinched at shadows or whispers. Rusty was always at her side, moving like a shadow, alert and alive, the copper sheen of his coat gleaming in the sun. On a bright spring morning, Charlotte stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, taking in the vastness of her land. She could see the ridge where the first riders had appeared. The eastern pasture where fire had once threatened everything, now green and alive with fresh grass. Rusty grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily, ears turning toward her as she called. "Come here, boy," she said softly. The stallion trotted toward her, movement smooth and powerful, head held high, eyes bright and intelligent. He stopped beside her, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that had become their quiet language over the years. Charlotte placed a hand against his neck, feeling the warmth and strength beneath her fingers. "You were the best thing this ranch ever gave me," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the breeze. "More than land, more than a home. You gave me a family." Rusty nudged her gently, and she smiled, knowing he understood in the way only he could. Together they had built something that neither fire, nor greed, nor loneliness could take away. The town of Cottonwood Creek had changed too. The story of the copper, stallion, and the woman who fought alongside him had spread far and wide. People who had once doubted Charlotte now nodded in respect, tipping hats when she rode past. Ranchers offered advice or a helping hand, and the laughter that had once followed her in town was replaced by admiration. Hackett and his men were gone for good, their threats and violence remembered, only as stories told in quiet tones by those who had witnessed them. Charlotte's ranch had become a symbol not of wealth or power, but of courage, resilience, and the bond between human and animal. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with chores, tending to cattle, checking fences, brushing Rusty and Silver, repairing whatever needed repair. Afternoons brought training and exploration, teaching Rusty to respond to commands, allowing him to roam the property under her watchful eye, and watching the land itself recover from years of neglect and abuse. Nights were quiet, with the stars overhead and the soft sounds of the ranch drifting through the air. Sometimes she would sit on the porch with a book or her rifle at hand, Rusty lying nearby, the world calm and steady around her. She often thought about the day she had first stepped onto the property, a girl chasing a dream for a single dollar, and marveled at how much had grown from such a small beginning. Despite the safety and prosperity, Charlotte never forgot the lessons of that first fire, the night of terror, or the nights she spent watching the shadows with only Rusty beside her. She maintained her vigilance, cleaning weapons, checking locks, reinforcing fences. She knew the world could be cruel, and that threats often came when least expected. Yet she had also learned that courage and loyalty, when nurtured, could turn even the smallest, most fragile hope into something formidable. Rusty had taught her that. Together they faced fear and danger, not as separate beings, but as a unit, each protecting the other, each understanding the other's needs and instincts without words. Charlotte often walked the property alone in the quiet of dawn, Silver following at her heels, Rusty at her side. She would run her hands over his mane, feeling the strength and history in every muscle, and speak to him about the day ahead, about the land, about the people who now respected the ranch and its keeper. "We've done well, Rusty," she would say. "We've done better than anyone expected." The stallion would nudge her in response, eyes soft, ears relaxed, a gesture that meant everything and nothing at the same time, a silent agreement that the past was behind them and the future was theirs to shape. Over time, Charlotte began training a small herd of horses, teaching them what Rusty had taught her, and watching as trust built between them, slow and careful. She raised young cattle, cultivated crops, and established routines that ensured the ranch thrived year after year. Visitors came occasionally, curious about the legendary copper horse and the woman who had fought alongside him, and Charlotte welcomed them, showing her land with quiet pride, always accompanied by Rusty, who remained the heart and guardian of everything she had built. And still, every morning, the first thing Charlotte did was walk to the barn, greet Rusty and speak to him softly. Sometimes she thought about all the moments when she could have given up, when fear or exhaustion might have broken her resolve. But Rusty had never wavered, and she had followed his lead, learning that courage was not about absence of fear, but the willingness to face it together. In that quiet understanding, the ranch became more than land, more than home. It became a testament to survival, loyalty, and the quiet, unbreakable bonds formed through shared struggle. Charlotte Abbott had bought a ranch for $1, a sum so small it could barely be counted. Yet what she truly gained, what Rusty had given her, and what she had nurtured in return, was priceless. A life built from courage, trust, and unwavering companionship. A home reclaimed from ruin, a legacy of resilience, and a partner who had fought beside her when the world tried to take it all away. 2 years after the first hoofprints appeared in the dirt, Charlotte stood on her porch, watching Rusty graze in the morning, light polished copper in the sun, and realized that the ranch, the horse, and the life she had built were the sum of every decision she had dared to make, every challenge she had refused to yield to, and every ounce of trust she had given and earned. She smiled as Rusty came to her side, resting his chin once more on her shoulder, and whispered, "We did it, boy. We made it, together." And in that moment, the wind across the prairie, the sun on the fences, the gentle stir of the pasture, and the steady, intelligent gaze of the copper stallion spoke the truth she had always known. That life, when faced with courage and loyalty, could be more than survival. It could be extraordinary. Charlotte Abbott had bought a ranch for $1, but what she had truly gained was priceless.